I am not the first person to make this analogy, but I liken modern day superheroes to the equivalent of the Greek myths, for
Hmm.
instance. These are morality tales largely. These are just so stories. And so many of them are about doing what's right, even if no one ever knows that you've done it, or taking
Hmm.
responsibility for your actions, or wrestling with our inner humanity and our inner demons. And when I was growing up, they were very much, relegated to children's literature. Obviously, that's all changed with the MCU.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's become an entire new genre, like the Western or the musical or
Hmm.
something like that. Entire generations a- have been sort of inculcated, in these lessons and in these stories. And I don't think there's any way to dispute now how it's shaped modern culture.
What would you define as a great hero? What makes a hero great in your mind?
In my personal opinion, a great hero is someone who is willing to put their own livelihood on the line, someone who is willing to do what's right, even if the people are around him are afraid, or her or them, to do what's right, and putting the welfare of others in front of the welfare of yourself. And in my mind, that's what makes a great hero.
Let's go back to that point you just made about how much these stories have shaped recent social understanding, collective understanding of good and evil, right and wrong, heroic and villainous. How do you see that effect? How do you think that the stories that are told about heroes and superheroes among them have shaped society? What do you see as the effects, good or ill, for the entertainment's influence on public morality?
Well, I think with comic books and then the early comic book adaptations, there was a much clearer division between good and evil, right?
Hmm.
And I would cite, you know, uh, writers like Alan Moore and Frank Miller and others who, in the late 80s and early 90s, with The Dark Knight and Watchmen and other books like that, where they started doing a revisionist take on these superheroes and started exploring, the darkness in some of them, and in some cases, perhaps even the negative effects of them. And I think with Batman Begins and then later on with The Dark Knight, which were obviously two films I was involved in, I think that marked the first time in cinema where a revisionist take was applied to these classic archetypes. And
Hmm.
then we really started exploring the shades of gray, the negative sides of being Batman, the pros and cons, and not just what it meant for Bruce Wayne, but what it meant for Gotham City, what it meant for the world at large. It's a double-edged sword. And in some cases, as it is in real life, the line between a hero and villain is quite blurry.
How intentional was that with The Dark Knight? The way in which the morality became more ambiguous or at least open to discussion. When you're developing that kind of story and then beyond, how deliberately are you wrestling with questions of good and evil?
Well, in the case of Batman Begins, The Dark Knight with Chris in those early days, it was very intentional. The conceit that we arrived on, and I think Chris was thinking this even before I started working with him, was that for the first time, we were going to treat Batman as if he were real and apply the real world rules of not just physics, but everything. There had to be a
Hmm.
reason for the utility belt. There had to be a reason for the batters on the cowl, how the cape would work. And so by extension, that led to everything. Well, how would people react on social media? How would the police react? And it seems obvious now, but that was a very revolutionary and risky approach at the time. That was not how comic book movies were made or perceived.
You've written some brilliant villains, and since we're on The Dark Knight, the Joker is obviously one of the most charismatic villains of the last half century or more. And I'm curious, What makes a good villain from a writer's point of view?
So I think a good villain, first of all, has to really believe in what they're doing,
Mm,
right? They're not, you know, most villains, even in the real world, are the heroes of their own story. And so we started applying that idea to characters Joker and Bane and all of the above. And in the Dark Knight films, and later on in most of my writing, even in the villains in Foundation, or when I lead writers' rooms, I'll often say, let's not talk about the fact that they're villains. What do
hmm
they want, and how is that in conflict with the protagonist? And well, if we sketch out these villains, if we go into some of their biographical detail, if we understand why they became what they became, then we'll start to feel for them. And that was thought of as something bad. And I said, no, that's interesting. That makes it more tragic. And the line in the real world is very blurry between heroes and villains.